Let's give up some love for DJ Soldier. Thank you so much for your fabulous music, and thank you for being with our Cambridge OST community. We really enjoyed you. Come back again. Thank you so much. So we're preparing to transition to our final segment of Symposium 2021. And if you're just joining us, we are recording our sessions, and we invite you to please drop your name, organization, and email in the chat so that the Agenda for Children can stay connected with you. We will be having a keynote presentation, which will be moderated by our co-director, Kari Milner. Our keynote speaker is the Professor Ceasar McDowell from MIT, and Kari will introduce him. At the conclusion of our keynote, we will have facilitated breakout conversations, as Terrell shared with you, so that we can look forward into the future and start to take actions toward that future that we're imagining for our young people, particularly our Black and Brown youth in Cambridge. So turning it over to you now, Kari. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Barbara. Great to see everyone here today. I have the privilege of introducing Professor and Dr. Ceasar McDowell. For those of you who need to hear my name, it's Kari Milner. I'm one of the co-directors of the Agenda for Children, as you've heard. We are super excited to be putting on this hybrid, the term of the year symposium. A big shout out to the Agenda for Children team, especially those you see in the background, and also Barbara for orchestrating so much of what you see today. Ceasar McDowell is actually an old friend and colleague of mine. And I was excited when both Barbara and Mercedes mentioned his name and said, hey, do you think Ceasar McDowell would be available to come and be a part of our symposium? Ceasar is over at MIT. He also has been faculty at Harvard. I can imagine other places as well. And he currently is associate department head. He might have been promoted since this was written, but this is a man who is doing a lot. He is a professor of practice of community development. He has multiple degrees from Harvard and other places. He focuses on the development of community knowledge systems and civic engagement. He works and does research around mass media and technology, and promoting democracy and community building, the education of urban students, the development and use of empathy in community work, civil rights history, peacemaking, and conflict resolution. He's also director of the Global Civic Engagement Organization, Dropping Knowledge International, former president of the Interacting Institute for Social Change. I could go on and on, co-founder of Civil Rights Forum, also a former and founding board director of the National Board for the Algebra Project Incorporated, which is another way I got to know Ceasar, serving on that board with him. And I actually did also take a course with Ceasar. I was thinking about that last night, focusing on the use of media and towards community change. So we'll hear from Ceasar in a moment. I give you Ceasar's introduction, and then for the balance, I want to give Ceasar a little bit of an introduction to us. So we are, Cambridge, we are OST, we are out of school time. That is what this symposium is dedicated to. That is who you see in so many of the panels in this Zoom, folks who are either working directly in out of school time, programs, organizations, spaces, those who partner with us, those who support us, those who share young people and families with us, both in school and out of school. We know that out of school time is a special place. It is a special set of opportunities. A couple of years ago, actually at our symposium, we did a workshop where we invited Cambridge Public School principals and other district leaders to come and strategize with us about how we can be more effective in partnering, but ultimately how we can be more effective in creating more out of school time magic for young people. And we use this concept of magic because that just really encompassed what we were feeling when we talked about what is OST doing for our young people, for our families, for our community. Some of the things that we know out of school time does and can do is it provides students with voice and choice. We have a large diversity of staff and quality across providers. We emphasize a culture of safety and fun, love and high expectations. We have an opportunity to help young people with many different types of transitions. We work with a lot of Black and Brown families and young people and multiple siblings for multiple generations. Our programs get to know families, they get to know extended family. We create spaces where young people and staff can take risks, where we can reveal new talents, where we can open new pathways, operations for self-exploration, and to develop identity outside of school. Then, of course, individualized, differentiated support, including a very strong emphasis on social emotional learning. And I could go on. So OST, with all that magic, is who you see in front of you. I also want to give a special shout out to the panelists that just shared with us. That's Ashley, Michael, Donna, King Solomon, and Queen Cheyenne. Yes, we had royalty with us. Actually, they're still with us. In fact, you see a lot of Cambridge royalty here, real talk. And those of us from Cambridge know what I'm speaking about. For multiple generations, we got royalty in the Zoom building. Those folks were representing out of school time providers and models such as Black Yard, Innovators for Purpose, City Sprouts, Black Response, and of course, let's not forget the multi-talented moderator, Tyrell, who is also repping for his Boys to Men program and model, which he founded. I want to share with Ceasar and anybody else who's just arriving some inspirations from the panel. We recognize that there are different sides and lived experiences across Cambridge that we are trying to understand and support in different ways. We know that we can encourage and push for continuous learning and development. We're inspired by authentic relationships, and we know that they're required for authentic connections with young people. We believe in the high potential of youth. We believe that bringing young people, particularly of color, outdoors, and to give them nature-based experiences are something they deserve, and also something that has been taken from us. And so there's an urgency there. We are understanding about living our values through our programs, through our systems, and through our communities. We also are inspired by folks who are building curriculum with youth. So with all that being appreciated and said, what else have we learned about how OST fits into and sets a tone for the city of Cambridge and the young people growing up here? We know OST providers and programs have always served young people, kids and families with essential supports, relationships, places to learn and grow. We also know our city is changing. We have benefits from the Cambridge Community Foundation's recent report highlighting some changing demographics, showing that we do have less Black and brown folks being able to stay in Cambridge because of the economic picture and inequities, but we still have a high concentration of babies, children, youth, and families of color living in or near poverty, which means they're lacking many resources. So after so many generations of youth and families utilizing out-of-school time programs and the system that we support through the Agenda for Children and many other providers in this city, you would think and hope we're serving them all effectively. But we know there's more that could be done. We also know that some programs and some opportunities still are not equitably accessible. And that is why we continue to do this hard work. Before I hand it off to Ceasar, I just want to also recognize last night I had the chance to tune into Cambridge Public Library's conversation with Ta-Nehisi's Coates with the author series. And during the Q&A, somebody asked a question of Mr. Coates about how he would essentially think to support, efforts to improve life for the Black and brown community in Cambridge, or, sort of along those lines. And I appreciated his response because he immediately said, "Don't ask me." He said, "You need to ask and speak to the Black and brown people here in your community." Again, that's who you see in so many of the tiles here at the Zoom. We are here, we grew up here, we continue to invest in each other and in this field. And Dr. McDowell, Ceasar, you're one of us. And so I want to hand this off to you, and I want to repeat the question, which is really the title of this section. Are we, as in OST, the out-of-school time community, and the leaders in it, and the providers in it, implicated in the exclusion of those we serve? And what is the role of out-of-school time in strengthening democracy from the margins, especially during this critical and challenging time? Thank you.
Thank you, Kari, and it's really wonderful to see everyone and to see all these wonderful faces and to actually be talking to folks in Cambridge. It's just so good to be among what I always say are some of the unsung heroes of our time here. I mean, like all of us, you've been through an extraordinarily difficult period, one that has implicated people, impacted people across the world. And I think as a nation shut down to contain the pandemic, you remained open to the needs of our children. And I think it's crucial to actually name what you have struggled with over these past 18 months, at least some of those things. I mean, we've come out of a global pandemic that today has cost the lives of 3.5 million people in the world. Over 17,000 of those were in Massachusetts, and about 125 were in Cambridge. In this 18 months, we began in this country what many have called a racial awakening in America, demanding the country recognize that Black Lives Matter and that we need to do more to move from racial awareness to being anti-racist. It is interesting to note, now that the kind of new surveys numbers coming out have shown that kind of prejudge the support for Black Lives Matter and these issues have dipped below what they were before George Floyd's killing. Right? So they rose quite high for a couple of weeks after that, and now they have dipped further below that for white people in this country. So this, I don't know if it's so much a racial awakening as it is a reminder of the racial issues we have in this country. And that's why at the same time, you've had to negotiate the rise of a kind of white nationalism and its emerging threat to democracy and the safety and security of Black, brown, and queer people in our society. And we've also, as Kari mentioned, this unprecedented rise of poverty in America, in Cambridge, coupled with the gain of extraordinary wealth among very few. Through all of this, you've responded with what I'd like to call a kind of creative resilience. You've stayed true to your core while responding to the challenge of the day. Many of you have adopted technology that allowed you to stay connected with young people and their parents. You found new ways to support ongoing learning and future creativity. and of course, you attended to their critical, emotional, and developmental needs. And now, with more and more people being vaccinated, the relaxing of restrictions and the coming of summer, we're all breathing a deep sigh of relief and waiting for a day things will go back to normal. But there is no normal to go back to. That's the reality. And so what we have really is an opportunity to create a new normal, right? A new normal for what this society can be, for how we are working to create, to imagine that, and actually bring that to fruition. And I believe the essence of this new normal needs to be grounded in one central fact. The city has changed, the world has changed, and it's not a new change. And here's one of the fundamental changes I think we have to face. And it's a challenge we've had for a while. And it's interesting, Kari, you mentioned that even in Cambridge, that change has actually been less than what we thought, but you'll get what I'm saying here. Because the reality is, in this city, in this country, in this world, no matter where we go, it doesn't matter where we are moving forward, that we're continuing to live among the most demographically complex set of people who've ever lived together. That's our reality. And we don't have the process or the infrastructure to support that kind of complex public, to do what a public needs to do in order for a just democracy to exist and flourish and ensure equality for all people. So basically, we have a situation with the kinds of people we have living together with no mechanism that allows them to do what they need to do for justice to prevail. Well, in order to actually understand, I think, why this is important, I need to say a little bit about kind of what I mean by democracy. And so for a moment, I'm going to share some slides with you. I usually don't do that, but I'm going to do it this time. So you'll excuse me while I do that. Can you see that? Is that big enough for you? So the first thing I want to say is I'm going to say a little bit about what I mean when I say the word democracy, okay? When I say democracy, actually, I'm going to do it this way. It'll be much easier for me to navigate. I think of it this way. The democracy exists kind of when people who are interdependent are able to struggle with traditions that bind them. Hope you can see all that. And interests that separate them. So they can realize a future that is an equitable improvement on the past. And I use this framing because oftentimes when we think about democracy, we talk about the relationship of individual citizens to institutions. But the reality is democracy relies on the relationship of people to people, right? And the way we're able to do that. And what I love about this quote is that it highlights two things that are really essential. One is that it's a struggle. And two, we have to create the spaces for that struggle to happen, right? We can't shy away from it, right? And all of us are engaged and implicated in that. And we're struggling with two things, right? Kind of traditions that we hold on to that may be getting in our way and interests that are actually getting in our way. And we're doing it because we're actually trying to make an equitable improvement on the past. And why that last sentence is so important is because often when we are in the work, in the field, on the ground, trying to make change, sometimes we feel like we're not doing enough, right? We don't realize and don't hold on to the fact that the day-to-day improvements on equitable, the day-to-day equitable improvements will actually get us to a more equitable world. We won't get there, we won't leapfrog there, but there are some things, and I'll talk about those things that we can do to accelerate the way we are actually able to get there. So what I would like to say now is that one of our places, I think the question for me is that our place, that education, for example, is one of the few public places left in this society, institutions that care about the public. And it says to me that we then have to take on the responsibility of being one of those containers in which that struggle can happen. Now, we all know that the institutions of education, the systems, tend to do very poorly at that, which I think creates this really amazing opportunity for out-of-school programs, right? To really be the places that are able to really embrace what it means to create a container that allows not only young people, but their families to engage and learn how to engage in the struggles together with the complexity of who not only they are, but the people in which they live with. Because it's in your spaces that you hold that complexity. It's all there, right? All of it. So it seems to me that there's several questions we can begin to ask ourselves, right? To match it into this space, right? I mean, like, what if you're a program with the one place where poor and BIPOC parents felt, this is the place where I have voice and agency? What would it mean if young people knew that here, I am learning to hope in the midst of so much societal conflict? What if your programs embrace technology to erase barriers of participation and open up a whole new worlds of engagement participation? And what if your programs retain their uniqueness but provided a seamless way for students to move between them as their needs and situations changed? What if? There are 1,000 questions out there, but I think they're really important for us to start to engage with if we're going to be able to step in to creating this kind of new normal, right? And I think if we're not ready to take these kinds of steps I just mentioned, and open yourselves up to these kinds of questions, imagine yourself, as one of the few containers for the possibility of the struggle, then you actually might be complicit in actually holding things back, right? You may be part of that problem. So I think what you have to ask yourself, and what you need to confront, this, what do we need in order to confront these kinds of challenges that are before us to actually start to create this normal? So it's not enough to say we have to be about democracy. We have to realize one other really crucial fact that all of us, and I think everybody in this room is very aware of, that racism and racial inequality, as well as economic opportunity, have a firm foothold in every part of America. So in order to create a new normal that addresses this challenge, I think there's some things we need to consider and think about as we are imagining into and thinking about how we might change what we're doing and how we're doing it to create this new normal, to imagine into it. And I sometimes call these things like a set of design principles. So I'm going to lay out 8 of these. 3 I'm going to go into more detail. A couple others I'm going to skip over because I really want us to spend our time in dialogue, right, around these issues and the things that I'm bringing out here. So let me say a little bit about what I say these design principles, right? There are kind of certain things you have to design for, think about if we're actually going to imagine into a new future. The first one of these is what I call the design for the margins. We have, in some sense, a very interesting way of dealing with problems in society, even when we are working, right? Working to improve the lives of Black and brown poor kids in this society, we tend to do the same thing. And that is, one, we either adapt other practices and just make them available, so practices that weren't designed for them, or 2, because we're in these institutions, we sometimes design our efforts so that they will have some appeal to a broader part of society, even though our desire, and maybe even our population, is really primarily kids of color. But the reality is, and the things we have to step into and not be afraid of, is that we primarily, if we're going to build these kinds of spaces, really that create a new reality, a new normal, we have to first design everything so that it first serves those who are at the margins. And that really means rethinking everything. That's why I put the quote up front, right? That race and racism are deeply embedded in all of our institutions. That means that if we really want to design for something for the margins, we have to pay particularly attention to every aspect of that so that it serves those at the margins. Now, why? There are lots of reasons for that, but I'm going to give you 2. One is because those at the margins are actually living with the failures of our systems, right? And that failure actually is around these kind of 5 things, right, that people don't have. Social connectedness, stability in their lives, safety and security, mastery, and access to relevant resources. You can figure that as money if you want to, or education, or a whole series of other things. Point is, this idea of what happens when people are actually in these vulnerable positions is that one or more of these are actually unstable in their lives, right? That can be true for anyone. But for people at the margins, almost all of these are actually in jeopardy, right? They actually don't have all of these in a sustained way that keeps them whole. And so when we're thinking about this issue of designing for the margins, we have to keep in mind that what we're trying to do is build these domains, right, around these 5 domains. We're trying to create stability, safety, mastery, these access to relevant resources, and social connectedness. It also means that when we're looking at programs that we're developing for folks at the margins, we have to assess their effectiveness, not in terms of head counts of how many people came into a program and left the program, but how well are we looking at building social connectedness. I had a friend who was running a drug treatment program for young people in Chicago. And they had a state contract, and the state said to them all the time, okay, here are the outcomes you have to hit, right? Here are the, you have to serve this many kids. We want to see this kind of we want to see this kind of turnover of kids leaving from your program, and we don't want to see recidivism, and we don't want to see people coming back. It has to be, they have percentages for everything. And their program, in some sense, they knew their program was actually working, but from all those indices, they were failing. So for example, they would have kids who would relapse, or maybe even, relapse, wouldn't sign up for the program, but would always hang out around the space. And what they understood at that point in time is there was some form of what we were doing that was providing some social connectedness for these kids. And so we need to keep that going. We didn't fail, we started to actually create the opportunity to that. So if we looked at the problem only as, are they using or not using, we're missing a whole lot. The real issue is, are we creating a piece of social connectedness for them? Are we creating a little place of safety for them, right? And if we're able to do that, we're starting to build something. So anyway, I want to go on though about the margins, because the other piece about what we're afraid of about the margins is sometimes we think if we focus on and absolutely do something that only we know is absolutely going to work for kids at the margins, for Black and brown folks, for poor folks, somehow we're going to leave out other people. And then they're going to be upset. Well, it's just the opposite of that, right? When you design for folks at the margins, right, folks who have resources will find their way into that solution, right? Because they have the resources. More often what you have to do is guard against them taking over the thing that you've actually created for people in the margins. That's the problem space. But if you do it and take it on, you actually create these new opportunities. I always like to kind of use that example, and some of you may have heard this before, of like, this design of kind of the curb cuts and sidewalks is something designed for one particular purpose that has had benefits for all kinds of people. And yet we have to keep innovating on it because that issue of the margin keeps getting pushed out further and further all the time. That's why you've seen these curb cuts move from being soft surfaces to being ripple surfaces, right? Because they realized at some point in time they weren't with these slight inclines. They were really deceiving to people who were sightless. So they put the bumps on them to actually give them a notion that they were coming to a curve. So this issue of dealing with the margins is something that you don't solve. It's something you continually work on and continually push on. I want to skip over to a couple. I'm going through 3 really fast. I'm going through them fast because I think you know what they are. The other is you have to really design for equity. If you don't design for equity, you won't get equity as an outcome. And just because you're designing for the margins does not mean in and of itself you have equity as an outcome. It means you have an opportunity to bring people into a space. But then to think about how you get equity as an outcome is something you also have to explicitly design for. You also have to think about, and it's interesting because I think the pandemic pushed us greatly in this way, is that we live in both worlds, an analog and a digital world, right? What we've been doing before is living in an analog world. The pandemic pushed us into a digital world, that's misspelled, pushed us into a digital world. And all of a sudden now, a lot of us want to go back to that analog world. But I think we need to realize we're in both. And now we have to figure out how to navigate both of those worlds together, right? Because we're going to be living in both of them. And they give us an incredible amount of opportunities for things we didn't even think were possible before. Notions about collaboration, right? If we're going to be one of these containers, really, that allow people to engage in the struggles that we need in order to build democracy, we have to figure out how to design that container so it forces people into collaboration, right? And I don't mean force in the strength way. I mean forces create the conditions in which collaboration is what people will have to do in order to meet their needs. And the last one is, not the last one, the next one is, and we need to start designing for more ecologically based solutions. And I want to say a little bit about what I mean by this. There are two ways to think about these ecological solutions. One is to think about, we want to do things that really connect us to the environment. The other is thinking about ecological ways of knowing and being and what they mean for the way we act. So one example I can give you of this is a good friend of mine's, actually he's not a good friend, he's a friend, someone I know. He used to be head of this huge corporation, and Mitsubishi Corporation, as a matter of fact. And when he was head of Mitsubishi Corporation, there was an action against them taken by the Rainforest Alliance, right? And the Rainforest Alliance was really about protecting the rainforest. And so they set out to do an international campaign to boycott Mitsubishi. Now, the interesting thing about that is Mitsubishi had hardly anything they did that was impacting the rainforest. They had a little, and these activists figured, yeah, but they're a big target. And if they say something and do something, then it's going to make an impact. And so my friend, Tachi Koichi, what he ended up doing as chairman of the board of Mitsubishi is, he actually said, I don't understand this, so I'm going to go spend 2 weeks living with these folks who are doing these protests against us. I want to understand what it means for them. And he came back, and a couple of things he ended up doing is he said, you know, there are principles that are embedded in our ecology of our world that we need to adapt into what we are doing day to day. So I just lift up one of those for an example of what I mean by ecological solution. He says, if you look at nature, there is no waste. But if you look at our practices, we create waste all the time. And it doesn't mean waste like material waste only, but think about how much time we waste of people, right? How much of their time we waste. We talk about reaching out to parents, right? And wanting to engage them, but how many different organizations in a city like Cambridge do we have trying to make connections with parents, right? How many different opportunities are we creating? And how do those opportunities connect with each other? In some sense, because of our separateness of organizations and our individual needs around institutions, we are basically wasting their time. They know it, they don't engage. Perhaps we could think in a very different way about what it might mean to actually create one seamless way to bring parents and their concerns into all of these systems that we're a part of. There's actually an organization that I've been doing some work with called the Living Voices Network. And I can talk about this during a question and answer period more, which is actually trying to create a mechanism for doing this that really creates the support for online, face-to-face conversations that can actually live in a shared online environment that individuals can control who can see their information, and there are conversations about different things, but they can share those across any kinds of set of institutions. This is a way of having one seamless kind of entry point into people's narratives and voice that others can be allowed to share and see, as opposed to everyone seeing I've got to have that for me to understand individually, and I have to create an individual way to get there. The others, you know, these multiple forms of expression, really important things we have to make sure we create in our new systems. We also have to make sure that we're preparing people to really understand the systemic issues in our society and change them. But the most important thing we have to do, right, in these new containers, if we're going to make them work, is we have to design for healing, right? People are wounded and traumatized and injured by the society we put together, by the experience they've gone through, and they will continue to be. And so if we don't recognize that and always see that people need the space, the opportunity to at least acknowledge the pain that they're living with, the trauma they've gone through, it will be impossible for us to move forward, for them to actually engage in struggle with anyone, unless we create that opportunity for us all to see that and acknowledge that it's there. A friend of mine's window, who used to be at the city Cambridge planning office at one point in time, talked about, you know, you go to city hall, town hall meetings, and just, you know, sometimes people show up and they're mad, and you know, you want to kind of cut them off, keep them to 3 minutes, whatever it is. And he says, you know, if we were a really healthy city, probably for every effort we have, the first thing we would do is have a town hall for venting. We'd create the space to say, come, bring your anger, bring what you have, and let us share it together. Because if we don't, we can't move forward. So part of what I'm inviting in this, and trying to say in all of this, is that we have an opportunity to really shift the way we are moving our society forward. We can only do it in a positive way if we focus on those who are at the margins. And if we see our ability to work with those who's the margin as these essential step to building an equitable democracy. And in order to build that equitable democracy, what we need to do is take opportunities to create spaces where people can practice and build that kind of muscle for democracy. And that means learning how to engage with this really complex public and others that they sit next to all the time. You do that, you naturally have that space, but what would it mean to actually turn that space and focus it on this issue, right? Yes, that doesn't mean stepping away from serving kids, right? It doesn't mean that at all, but it does mean stretching and seeing serving kids and their families is an important part. That every interaction is an interaction that can be used to strengthen people's ability and skills to actually be powerful actors in the democracy and learning how to navigate across the complexity of who we are. That's, I think, our challenge that we have before us. And so for me, where we're starting with and what I think is possible for us in this day and this age, all right, is that while we all need space and time to come back, once back, let's challenge ourselves to stay with the creative energy that allows you to respond effectively to the pandemic and to other things that are going on. Use that energy to reimagine a new normal, designed from the margins that creates at least one space where this demographic complex can emerge. I want to stop there for now. I can't stop my screen.
All right. Thank you, Ceasar. Unbelievable, powerful content, so relevant for us in this field and also in this time. We did want to have some time for Q&A.
Oh, there it is.
So we'll do some exchanges with Dr. McDowell, and then we will move forward to some breakouts. I'm gonna hand it over to Mercedes or Barbara, depending on what you're ready for, to ask some questions of Ceasar. Thank you.
Hi, Ceasar. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay. It's great to see you. So one question that came up was, how can we engage specifically BIPOC families and youth with intentionality in our youth development work?
So, okay, none of this is easy. I'm going to admit that to begin with. But I want to answer a question. I'm going to turn it around, because I don't have the answer to all these things, right? This is all about intention and the focus. But what can you learn from what you did, what happened during this pandemic that allowed you to connect to some folks that you may not have been able to connect to before? How did you do that? What lessons came from that, and how might they be applicable to a kind of reemergence? Right? I think those are the kinds of questions we have, because the pandemic set up something totally different. And I'm not saying it provided the solutions. What it did was actually open up our creativity around what we knew was necessary, right? And we may have learned some things about particular parents and what they respond to that we can then apply differently as we reemerge. But in some sense, I think one of the core things we have to do is, this is part of what I was trying to say at the very beginning, we actually don't have the space in our democracy, in our society, for people to come and really just be and have their voice and actually be heard. It may be a long road. It may be maybe some of the first things you need to do is not so much try to engage these families in relationship to what's happening with your kids and your program, but maybe it's just creating a space for what they need and saying, okay, we can do that. There was a program in Chicago, I wish I could remember the name of it, but they created, it was a program that was actually serving older high school kids and a number of the kids who had been in trauma from gun violence. And one of the kids one day asked the program, can you help my mom? Right? And they ended up starting something called Mother's Circle, where they brought the mothers together because they realized all these mothers of these kids were living with the same trauma. And so then they started a small program with just mothers talking together to support themselves. And I think it's that kind of thinking, just saying, we're not bound by the thing that has allowed us to exist. We have to rethink our boundaries. And our boundaries have to be there much broader in order for us to succeed.
Thank you. With this redesign process that you described, are there principles that might be aligned with sort of a universal design process for learning?
Yeah. Yes and no with universal design, okay? This is why I always start out with design at the margins. I think if you start with universal design, you will continue to marginalize those at the margins, right? You really have to start with this principle of designing with and for people at the margins. It is our universality that keeps us from serving those at the margins.
One of the questions that came up yesterday is that many of us have talked about wanting a new and more equitable normal, but now how do we work with each other and those living on the margins to push against and also deal with reestablishment of the old norm?
Yeah, it's a really, really, really good question. I showed this thing called the Living Voices Network, and I actually think this might be one of, not it in itself, but its approach might be one solution, right? The population that you serve, I don't know how many programs, after school programs are in Cambridge, there are a lot. But what if you actually use that as a basis to organize parental voices and family voices? And so this is what I was saying about this Living Voices Network. What if instead of each organization trying to figure out how does it connect with its parents, you're actually inviting families into a citywide network about the voices of their needs. And assume from that you will get what you need. But the most important thing is to actually build a sense of empowerment by connecting a set of families who are already connected to an individual institution into a much larger network, and letting that network be part of the force to help not go back to the new normal, to the old normal, right? by creating, again, the spaces for people to have their voices, helping them figure out how to negotiate things together. Because I mean, as you all know, just because folks, you know, are Black and brown or come from, it doesn't mean they're all aligned. It doesn't mean that at all, right? But in some sense, we have to figure out how to support people to recognize their common struggle together and work together through that.
I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that LVN work, but also speak about how can OST programs engage in power sharing, like inviting people to the table from who have been traditionally marginalized, but what's one step that we can take towards sharing power with people who have not always had power?
So I think there were two questions there, right? One was about the Living Voices Network and the other one was about sharing power, is that correct? Okay, thanks, Mercedes. Look, there's nothing new in the power sharing role. Like that's old work, right? That's old work. Now through the one-to-one conversations that you have with people. Yeah, okay. Through the one-on-one work relationships. But in actuality, it would also require you to figure out what things are you willing to open up to power sharing, right? What spaces and where you have some authority and stuff are you willing and able to actually open up? And I don't know if that's around governance. Is it around, hey, you know, we have a budget of this, let's make our budget public and let's talk with parents about how we're utilizing it. You know, anything that actually has some sense of a power and authority associated with it that you can open up as a first step for yourselves is one way to do that. In terms of the LVN, yeah, somebody put in their Local Voices Network, you can actually find, yeah, it's interesting because the way it's set up, you can actually build a whole common network across all of your programs. You can have individual conversations, but you can connect them all. And I'm working with the team who's doing some of the design in the back end of the system. And so if there are things people want to do with it and creating up a new kind of connection, let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McDowell. We're so glad that you're here with
Thank
us.
you, Barbara.
We're about to go into breakouts. So let's give Professor McDowell some recognition. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we're going to have breakouts, and Kari's going to set those breakouts up for us. But Professor McDowell and Kari will be able to roam through the breakout rooms and perhaps chat with you during the next half hour. So back to you, Kari.
All right. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Ceasar. We want to always make space for folks to connect. It's been a common theme. And so we will get these breakout groups going. I know there's been a little bit of technical sort of support needed for some folks, including myself, just the way that my Zoom works on this laptop. So I think I will pass this in a moment to our technical crew to help with that transition. In the breakout rooms, we will have a allotted amount of time to talk about two particular questions. And you will have a facilitator and note taker in your room with you, friends of the Agenda for Children out of school time, colleagues as well. And then upon completion of the breakouts, we'll come back together. We'll have some time for some share outs. And we will essentially be winding down. We think Professor McDowell will be with us for that closeout time as well. So perhaps there's some additional reflections all the way around. And then we will be sending people on their way. So most importantly, let's get people into their breakouts. So the first question, there's two questions. So the first one you see in the chat, for those of you who can see the chat, given what you have heard and experienced today at the symposium, what are some ways you think out of school time programs can be catalysts for change in our community? Okay, so we want you to chop it up with your breakout about that. question number 2, more germane to the keynote. After hearing Professor McDowell's keynote, what is something new you plan to do or disrupt to authentically empower the voices of those you and your program seek to support? And by an extension, of course, I think there's a hard and obvious line drawn to those on the margins who your programs and staff seek to support. Your facilitators will have these questions on hand when you get into your breakouts. But if you can take some time now to prepare to engage around this. Can somebody help to let us know about how much time we'll have for the breakouts as we get in there?
We have 25 minutes for the breakouts. You'll have a facilitator in the room and you'll answer and have conversation around the 2 questions. Your facilitator will scribe the most important points, and then when we come back together for our closeout, Kari's going to invite some quick sharing out. So you should be able to see a link now popping up in the breakout rooms. Please click on that and you'll be sent to a breakout room.
Thank you, Barbara. So again, if you're picking up on the themes here for the questions, it's about how OST in our programs can be catalysts for change, and also really helping people to make space to begin to plan or commit to action steps. And who needs to be involved to create the changes through those action steps. So we're back and bringing a higher love, it sounds like. Let's do some report outs. Thank you. So let's just jump right in. If we have a volunteer from one of the breakout rooms, just go ahead, turn your mic on and tell us a little bit about what you guys were vibing on, headlines, takeaways, challenges, and I know there's some frustrations too. So don't be shy. Let's take advantage of this time.
I'm happy to speak on behalf of the wonderful and wise group 2, and it's a daunting task to try to give some headlines from the brilliance that folks brought. So just shout out to Barbara, Greg, Melissa, Vanessa, and Susan, the wonderful facilitator. I think first of all, just deep appreciation and like sense of the magnitude of the ideas that folks are really trying to hold. And I think a couple of things that I'll just highlight, one is real power of designing with and for the margins and how everything else can benefit everyone else when we actually center that and truly hold that, embrace it and do it unapologetically. Really thinking about how to sort of consider accountability differently and much more transparently and explicitly, and what are the structural ways we do that? What are the cultural ways we do that? What are the ways we bring that into our practice? What are the ways we surface also complaints, dissent, like truly give space for people to speak what they're bringing into the space, and particularly in positions of leadership, like in welcoming that, embracing it, and having confidence that we can work with that. Deep commitment to youth voice and recognition that young people can and should and will be critical voices in designing what moves forward. And then I think the last thing I'll just offer is the piece around really just being able to notice that sort of the solutions are going to come from connection and interdependence, that at an individual level, but also at a programmatic and institutional level, and that the city and the OST system and many of the systems in this city are not designed for interdependence, and yet so much critical need to come together and try to really disrupt that and create the kind of interdependence and collective approach that can get us where we want to be.
Hmm. Thank you, Daniel, Group 2, for your engagement on these issues. Another group want to jump in?
Sure. So basically our group spoke about how we can work together and kind of provide more support to young people by empowering them and talking about basically how we build from what we already started, and collaboration was also a very important factor in what we discussed. I really like the fact that I appreciated that everyone voiced their concerns for not knowing how to reach out to the agenda. And now they have the tools to, connect with each other and come up with different tools for ideas for kids to, come up with their own job opportunities, proposals. We even spoke about how the activities such as hiking, because since the pandemic, a lot of children are not really going outside and, getting them more together and more social outside, and really working within, the Cambridge network and organizations for more engagement to be more efficient. Is there anything I'm leaving out, group? I'm trying to just basically summarizing it.
I can share a bit.
Thank
As
you.
I said in the group, this conversation got a lot of exciting thoughts happening in my head. So I'm in a lot of places, but I remember a part of what we spoke about that was exciting to me is this idea of leadership's role in this power sharing concept. And I spoke specifically to the notion that, when I have a staff person that's working directly with young people, and I identify that their experience hasn't necessarily been with youth-centered voice in their thinking about program design, that one of the ways in which I help them to learn that skill and guide them into the understanding of how a youth-led and youth voice-driven group looks is that I provide that in our interaction and in how I interact with my team, so that I'm both talking about it and modeling it. And so as we think about this idea of power sharing and within systems, it really has to be something that exists throughout institutions and not specifically only within the direct service realm. Because I think that in the direct service realm, we are in fact conditioned to redesigning and reimagining frequently circumstances. That's the nature of the work. And so our adeptness in being able to rethink and reimagine is actually pretty solid, but we don't exist within institutions that are adept in doing such a thing. I think that's all I'm going to say on what I remember about our conversation.
Yeah, this is Dee, and I want to apologize to my group because I lost Wi-Fi, so had to go find my jetpack to sign back in. But in terms of the conversation, it sounds like consistent with the person who just spoke. One of the things that came up with, it's really important for leadership to model the kind of work that needs to be done to really bring people in from the margins. And it's really difficult to sort of make that shift and try to figure out how to do it yourself and how to support your staff to do it when you don't really even see any models for how that gets done. The other 2 points, important points I think that were made, is the importance of remembering that staff who are working to engage young people and families in this effort have been through the same pandemic as everyone else. And so there's also a real need for folks to think about healing among their colleagues and how important that is as well. And I'm sorry, I lost the third point. If anyone who is in the group can sort of chirp that out, I lost the third point that I was going to make. But those were 2 really important points that they made.
All right, so I'll share a little bit from our group. We kind of talked about how youth-centered, like any initiative, oh, there's my face, how it works and how there's like a weird power thing where, or I always think from my experience, at first we have to start with the power that we have and then build something that can give them power, and then we can share it. But it has to start with like acknowledging that you have that power in the first place, which can be like a little weird because you want it to be youth-led. So you have to kind of like think that through. And we also talked a lot about family engagement. And who was it in my group? Debbie, she had like a really good quote that I wrote down immediately, and I'm going to keep coming back to it. I am the families that I serve. So when we are doing anything that has to do with our families or getting them involved, making sure that, just like Dr. McDowell was saying, we have to go outside, like way to the ends of the margins, and make sure those are the students that we're recruiting for any youth voice opportunities, or those are the families that we're making sure that we get input from. And if I left anything out, please chime in on anyone else that was in the group.
A lot of the things that people said, we talked about in our group, and we did talk about young people of any age and giving them the space to express themselves. But we did also talk about leadership and listening, and how it's important to create the space to listen. But then once we listen, what are we going to do with that information? So there's nothing worse than somebody asking you for what you think, but you already know that the decision's been made for you. I think something that really stuck with folks was the point about wasting time, and how do we dismantle the usual narrative that we think and or say. I'll leave it at, if we're going to design for the margin, then we need to be laser focused on that and not use excuses like we ran out of time or that just didn't work and move on. And somebody also mentioned that it's challenging to make that change when you're not in a leadership position. So, and I would also just like to thank my group for a great conversation.
Thanks, Nancy. I want to thank your group as well, because I was able to crash in there and benefit from some really rich exchanges and ideas and frustrations, to keep this real. Change is not easy. We know this is not just a cliche. But I do want to take this moment to thank Ceasar again for joining us, for providing us with provocative thoughts, frameworks, reaffirming some things that us in this community, we have been pushing on, we have been trying to understand, we have been raising expectations, and hopefully reflecting back to ourselves and to leadership what it takes to more effectively, or as effectively as possible, serve the young people, the families that we seek to do. So Ceasar, I don't see you, but I do want to say goodbye. It's been too long. We hope that we can stay connected. And as I said earlier, you are an honorary member of our out of school time community here in Cambridge now. Ceasar does have multiple sources of Cambridge roots, and really nice to bring you back into the fold. So Ceasar, I don't know if you want to say anything on your way out.
Just to say thanks, everyone, and just really appreciative of the powerful work you're all doing. I only got to sit into 2 groups, and it was, thank you.
Thank you, Ceasar, again for being with us. We're at the close of our Symposium 2021, the 8th in a year, and whoo, we are so glad.
Thanks.
Yes.
We have never done a hybrid symposium ever. We started out day 1 hugging each other at Russell Field, vibing to music, eating lunch together, and just reconnecting. Yesterday, we were clubhousing it with the great Melinda Barbosa leading us, and it's some fabulous, deep conversations were had, and really exciting new ideas coming forth. And today we had our star-studded panel discussion led by our fabulous Terrell Dortch, and then Professor Ceasar McDowell. Ceasar brought it on home with provoking us to think about what it is that we're here to do and how do we change the fact that folks are being left at the margin, and we are very well positioned to respond to bringing them from the margin into our work, into collaboration with us. I want to acknowledge our tech people who've been behind the scenes, Ashley, Mercedes, Annie, stars. This couldn't have been done without them. I want to acknowledge our facilitators today, Melina, Nancy, Dee, Daniel, Barb, Mia, and anybody else, and Susan, anybody else I missed. Thank you so much. The agenda exists for you and because of you. And thank you for honoring us with your presence during this symposium. And I look forward to seeing you again. You could open your mic. Let's say goodbye, everyone. And Mercedes is going to take us